Tonight's journey begins not with battles or kings, but with a quiet question asked behind closed doors. How do you decide when a family is complete? We'll travel through medieval Persia, ancient Mesopotamia, and beyond, where people managed family size with calm decisions, careful contracts, and silent systems that shaped generations. If you enjoy slow, thoughtful history, feel free to subscribe, but only if it helps you unwind. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let the quiet details carry you. Let's begin with a Persian family's silent balance. In the heart of medieval Persia, where domed homes dotted the landscape and narrow irrigation canals traced lines across dry earth, family life unfolded quietly behind high adobe walls. These homes, clustered in oases or the older quarters of cities like Shiraz and Nishapur, held more than just parents and children. They held generations, secrets, quiet negotiations, and a centuries-old understanding of what it meant to grow a family wisely, not just widely. Unlike the empires that shouted their dominance through massive monuments or endless military campaigns, the Persians of the Islamic Golden Age managed their households with restraint and thoughtful planning. This was not a culture built on population growth for its own sake. It was one shaped by limitations, land, water, and law, and by a deeply embedded notion that prosperity came not from the size of one's family, but from its harmony. Family size, as strange as it may seem from today's lens, was not entirely a private decision. In the towns and villages of Persia between the 9th and 13th centuries, there was a shared understanding that the needs of the community and the household must balance. Too many children could stretch thin a family's inheritance and threaten their social standing. Too few could endanger labor power and longevity. Quietly, without slogans or official decrees, people learned to walk the line between growth and survival. Persian families often organized themselves around extended networks. The father was typically the head, but grandmothers, uncles, and older siblings often wielded considerable influence, especially when it came to decisions about marriage and childbearing. Young couples did not begin families on whims. They entered marriage under the guidance of contracts, nikahnamer, that spelled out expectations, obligations, and intentions. While these contracts were primarily legal in nature, many included clauses that reflected mutual understandings about when and how to start a family. There was no religious mandate in Islam requiring a couple to have children immediately. In fact, classical Islamic jurisprudence allowed for considerable flexibility. One key method of managing family size was azel, or coitus interruptus, which was not only practiced but widely discussed by jurists. Unlike in later European societies where such methods were cloaked in taboo, in medieval Persia it was acknowledged openly, though always discreetly. Consent between husband and wife was essential, and scholars debated its ethical boundaries in surprisingly nuanced terms. Contraceptive knowledge, modest though it was by modern standards, circulated through herbal traditions and women's oral networks. Midwives, called dayas, were among the most trusted figures in a household's private life. They advised not only on childbirth, but on spacing pregnancies. Recipes for pessaries made from cotton soaked in pomegranate rind or colocynth extract, or the careful timing of intercourse based on the lunar calendar, were passed from mother to daughter, often whispered over steaming pots of lentils or in the cool shade of courtyards where women gathered in the afternoons. But managing family size wasn't just a matter of avoiding too many mouths to feed. It was about ensuring the long-term stability of the household and its inheritance. Land was the primary source of wealth for most Persian families. It was rarely divided haphazardly. Islamic inheritance law, as defined by the Quran, assigned fixed shares to heirs, often resulting in the fragmentation of property across generations. Savvy families, especially those with only small parcels of land, had to be cautious. Too many heirs could dilute the family's estate into irrelevance. This concern led to subtle but significant social practices. While all sons were entitled to inherit, it was not uncommon for families to encourage only one or two sons to remain on the land. while others were apprenticed to trades, sent to work in cities, or entered into the scholarly or clerical professions. Daughters, often married into neighboring families, carried with them dowries that were calculated with an eye to both generosity and restraint. It would be easy to imagine that such restraint meant emotion was absent. But family in medieval Persia was not a cold calculation. It was tender and intricate, bound by the rhythms of the seasons and the quiet intimacy of daily life. Fathers recited poetry to their children, sometimes verses of Hafez or Ferdowsi, while mothers wove cloth and told stories of ancestors and saints. Every decision was shaped by love and caution, pride and memory. To manage a family was to tend a living tree, pruning its branches not to stifle growth, but to ensure strength and continuity. One often overlooked aspect of this silent balance was the role of temporary marriage, muta, a practice more common in certain Shia communities. Though controversial in many parts of the Islamic world, in Persia, it sometimes served as a socially acceptable way to test compatibility or even to formalize companionships in times of hardship. While not common across all classes, it provided a window into how personal relationships and reproductive choices were negotiated with surprising flexibility. In larger cities, especially in the scholarly centers like Ray or Isfahan, literacy and record-keeping allowed for more formal planning. Endowments, waqf, were often established by men to provide for their children, especially daughters, in ways that bypassed standard inheritance rules. These were legal tools, yes, but also cultural expressions of care. They allowed a father to ensure his daughters would be protected, educated, or supported, even if he feared the family land would one day be too thinly spread. Outside the city, walls, in the villages that clung to rivers or nestled into the folds of the Zagros Mountains, family size was managed more by custom than paper. Here, winter scarcity and summer harvests shaped what was possible. Children came when the rains had been good, when the granaries were full, and even when they didn't come, when a child was stillborn or a mother miscarried, the loss was marked with quiet prayers and the planting of a tree or the hanging of a new verse near the door. And so, family life in medieval Persia moved, slowly, deliberately. It was never stagnant, but it never rushed. The choices of one generation shaped the prospects of the next. It was not just about how many children a family had, but when, why, and how they arrived. Not through revolution or decree, but through generations of careful choices. The people of Persia managed to grow families that fit the shape of their world, neither too large to feed nor too small to endure. But how, in a society with no census as we know it and limited written documentation, did this quiet system of balance hold together across centuries? In the rhythm of medieval Persian life, family planning was rarely spoken about in the abstract. Instead, it unfolded slowly across calendars of sowing and harvest, whispered in conversations between mothers and daughters, or settled silently in the way space was arranged in the home. But while customs and herbal knowledge formed the outer walls of this system, the interior, its quiet engine, was economic reality. At the center of many Persian families was a simple fact. Most people lived at or near subsistence. The village economy functioned on small parcels of land, sometimes passed down through inheritance, sometimes redistributed under broader feudal arrangements. These plots were just enough to feed a household if the weather was kind. The irrigation system held and no disaster arrived at the door. In such a finely balanced world, adding another mouth was never a decision taken lightly. We know from surviving tax records, court petitions, and property ledgers that land ownership in Persia during the medieval period was typically divided among sons at marriage. This meant that each generation had slightly smaller holdings than the last, unless a family had the foresight to manage its numbers. Inheritance, then, wasn't just about passing on wealth. It was an incentive to regulate family size. Fewer children meant fewer heirs to divide the land, and fewer heirs meant a better chance at long-term survival. Interestingly, the this logic wasn't always expressed in words. There was little moralizing about large families being wrong or small ones being ideal. Instead, family size was treated like rainfall, something to be anticipated, managed, and quietly endured if it came in excess. But across the empire, from the gardens of Shiraz to the caravanserais of Khorasan, there is evidence that Persian families actively responded to these economic constraints with intentional spacing of children. One practice that helped was prolonged breastfeeding, often encouraged for 2 full years. This wasn't just a health decision. It also served as a natural form of contraception. The link was understood empirically, even if not scientifically, and in medical texts by physicians like Al-Razi and Avicenna, extended nursing was listed among the many preservative customs of family health. In villages, it was reinforced by midwives and older women, who often reminded young mothers to delay new pregnancies until their bodies were rested and their children stronger. Then there were the herbal aids, Persian traditional medicine, drawing from Greek, Indian, and local knowledge, offered a rich catalogue of plants believed to aid or prevent conception. The records are incomplete, and many details remain speculative, but several recurring names stand out, like wild rue, harmal, silphium, now extinct, and even pomegranate bark. Some were brewed into teas. Others were dried, burned, or crushed into powders. In some cases, these remedies were accompanied by ritual gestures, prayers, to ward off unwanted opening of the womb, or amulets to calm the belly. These weren't secretive. They were accepted parts of domestic life, passed down like spice blends or weaving patterns. No single herb or habit guaranteed results, but together they formed a web of quiet resistance to chance. And within that web, women especially found a measure of control, albeit limited, over their reproductive fate. Another intriguing element was the role of education. In larger towns and among wealthier families, girls were often taught rudimentary literacy and household accounting. This wasn't necessarily for empowerment in the modern sense, but it did allow women to participate more fully in managing the rhythms of domestic life. A literate mother could track religious calendars, calculate the cycles of fasting and fertility, and even read basic treatises on household health. One popular text from the 13th century, attributed to a scribe near Qazvin, included a chapter titled Matters of Womanly Timing, describing seasonal markers and diet guidelines believed to influence fertility. But even outside literate households, knowledge circulated. Through storytelling, poetry, and song, ideas about family, spacing, and survival were constantly reinforced. In fact, one of the most popular poetic genres of the time, didactic verse, often included stanzas about prudence in household matters. A well-known line from the poet Sa'di advised, "Grow not a garden where the well is dry. Let roots wait till spring shows mercy." To modern ears, this may sound metaphorical, but to Persian families, it carried practical weight. Don't plant or procreate if there is no water to nourish what comes next. Community dynamics also helped shape decisions. In tight-knit villages or town quarters, it was common for families to confer with their elders about spacing children or delaying further births, not for permission necessarily, but for support. When a young couple decided to wait before having another child, it might be an aunt or grandmother who stepped in to care for the firstborn or to reinforce the choice during religious festivals by praising their wise restraint. Social norms were rarely codified, but they were enforced gently, with praise, silence, or subtle exclusion. Of course, these customs didn't mean that every family planned perfectly, or even deliberately. Miscarriages, sudden deaths, and unpredictable economic turns meant that no system was foolproof. But in the long view, the Persian approach offered a balance between reverence for life and an honest reckoning with limits. It was not a culture of excess or fatalism. It was a culture of moderation. Perhaps the most telling evidence lies in how Persian families approached adoption and foster care. When couples were unable or chose not to have more children, they often took in orphans or distant relatives. This wasn't charity, It was community logic. Raising an extra child when you had the means was seen as virtuous, but having too many of your own without the means was considered reckless. Even today, echoes of this quiet philosophy remain in Persian culture. Visible in proverbs, family traditions, and village wisdom passed through generations. It's a form of historical resilience that left no grand monuments or conquests, but shaped daily life in profound ways. And so we're left with another quiet question. In a world that often measures success by scale and speed, what do we lose when we stop listening to the small, wise voices that whisper, "Not yet"? As Persian families moved quietly through the cycles of their lives, planting in spring, harvesting in autumn, enduring droughts, mourning losses, and celebrating births, they carried with them an unspoken philosophy. It was not written in law or chiseled into stone. Instead, it lingered in domestic rhythms, in the spacing between children's birthdays, in the way a mother measured lentils in the pot, and a father gazed out across a field barely large enough for one more mouth. The final piece of this delicate balance lay not in customs or herbs, but in the broader structure of society itself, how it rewarded restraint and discouraged recklessness, how it organized inheritance, and how it absorbed shocks through quiet flexibility. Let's begin with property law. In the medieval Persian countryside, land was everything. For most families, it was the only wealth that mattered. Formal deeds and registries did exist, especially under the bureaucratic Abbasid and later Seljuk administrations. But even in villages without ink or officials, everyone knew who owned what. And perhaps more importantly, they knew who would inherit it. Inheritance typically followed Islamic law, particularly after the formalization of Sharia-based governance. Sons inherited more than daughters, often twice as much, but all legitimate children had rights. For a family with 3 or 4 children, this could mean splitting a modest tract of farmland into slivers too small to support anyone. But here's where tradition stepped in. Instead of dividing land mechanically, families often agreed, quietly, informally, and communally, to designate one son as the primary heir, usually the eldest or the most capable, while providing other sons with trades, tools, or marriages into neighboring villages. This system, known locally as Vaqf-e-Bartar, wasn't enforced by courts, but by reputation. A father who planned wisely and spaced his children accordingly could avoid family disputes. A careless one risked seeing his land contested, his sons divided, and his grandchildren scattered. This planning extended even to the structure of the home. Many rural Persian homes were built with modular courtyards, allowing a room or wing to be added every few years. A couple might begin with a single room and earthen hearth, expand when the first child was born, and delay further construction and conception until resources caught up. Family size and home size were often reflections of the same careful arithmetic. Religion played its part too, though more as a backdrop than a commander. Islam encouraged large families, but it also praised moderation, mercy, and wisdom in stewardship. Scholars debated the permissibility of contraceptive methods like coitus interruptus, AZL, and while views varied, many prominent theologians, including Al-Ghazali, acknowledged it as acceptable under certain conditions, especially if used for the health of the mother or the stability of the household. This quiet theological flexibility gave families room to make personal decisions without shame. Contraception was not hidden, but neither was it flaunted. It was treated as any other aspect of household management, like pruning trees or rationing grain. The goal was never denial of life, but the careful spacing of it, so each new child could arrive into a home ready to receive them. What about those who defied this balance, who had many children quickly, or who suffered repeated losses and kept trying against impossible odds? They too were part of the landscape. Every village had its exceptions. Some large families thrived, bolstered by lucky harvests or local patronage. Others suffered quietly, leaning on extended kin for help. In times of famine or political unrest, large families were especially vulnerable. A father who had once boasted of his many sons might find himself unable to feed them, and the community might not be able to rescue him. But even then, judgment was slow. Villages were not harsh with one another. They remembered how fragile life could be. A poor harvest, a child's fever, a goat that failed to give milk. These things could shift a family's fortunes overnight. And so, instead of punishing excess, the community simply remembered. The tale of a reckless farmer might be told years later as quiet instruction. He had too many mouths and too little rain. Beyond the countryside, in cities like Isfahan and Ray, similar calculations took place on different terms. Merchants considered the costs of dowries and apprenticeships. Artisans calculated how many sons they could train in a single workshop. Even in elite households, family planning was not unknown. Courtesans and concubines often had knowledge of herbal contraceptives, and wealthy women with access to books and midwives had more tools at their disposal, though their choices were still bound by status and expectation. Interestingly, adoption was common across class lines. In a culture where lineage mattered deeply, taking in a child was not seen as diluting the bloodline, but as reinforcing the household. Widows often raised nephews as their own. Childless, couples took in orphans as laborers and heirs. A child's arrival was not always the result of birth. It could also come from compassion, necessity, or quiet compromise. As the centuries passed, Persian society changed. Dynasties rose and fell. Sufi orders spread new spiritual ideas, and towns expanded into cities. But the principles of balance remained. Families continued to measure their growth against their means. The space between siblings still told a story, and the old wisdom endured in phrases passed down through generations. One proverb, still used in some rural parts of Iran, captures the heart of it. A warm bowl cannot feed a cold room. In other words, love and hope are not enough. Without planning, without warmth, shelter, and enough to share, even the richest affection cannot shield a child from hardship. It is easy in modern times to romanticize the past or to pity it. But the quiet systems medieval Persians built to manage family size reveal a different kind of legacy. One of deliberate moderation, grounded kindness, and survival through careful listening to nature, time, and one another. And perhaps that's the final lesson, that in an age before calculators or clinics, spreadsheets or statistics, ordinary people found ways to live with respect for their limits, not through fear or force, but through a silent balance. Long before the concept of family planning had a name, and millennia before the rise of modern medicine, the people of ancient Mesopotamia were quietly negotiating the terms of birth, fertility, and inheritance with ink, clay, and custom. In this arid land between the Tigris and Euphrates, where city-states like Ur, Lagash, and Babylon flourished, the cradle was not simply a symbol of joy. It was a decision point, measured, debated, and often, quite literally, contracted. This is the story of how family size and childbearing were managed not just with the help of midwives and prayers, but through the legal systems and survival strategies of the world's earliest known civilizations. Imagine a dusty courtyard in the city of Nippur around 2100 BCE. A young woman sits quietly as her father and a notary inscribe a small palm-sized clay tablet. She is about to be married, not in ceremony yet, but in record. The tablet outlines the terms of her union, a dowry of textiles and copper tools, the rights of inheritance should she die, and a clause, strange to modern ears, that specifies the number of children expected. Contracts like this were not rare. Mesopotamians left behind tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets, and many of them speak not only of property and debt, but of children. How many a wife might be expected to bear, who would raise them if she died, and what would happen if she failed to conceive. Parenthood was deeply personal, but it was also, unmistakably, contractual. In a society dependent on agriculture, survival meant balance. Too few children, and there were not enough hands for the fields or eyes for the shop. Too many, and inheritance splintered, poverty deepened, and households collapsed under their own weight. And so, Family size was treated with unusual pragmatism. The heart of Mesopotamian society was the household, Ikalu in Akkadian, in Sumerian. It wasn't just a place to live. It was a unit of economic production, religious duty, and political representation. The strength of a household depended heavily on the number and placement of its members. Children were expected, but not endlessly. They were seen not just as blessings, but as future laborers, heirs, and sometimes, if a contract allowed, commodities to be married off, adopted out, or pledged as part of debt settlements. Most Mesopotamian women bore between 2 and 5 children, depending on class and region. This number wasn't fixed by law, but it was shaped by architecture, nutrition, risk, and law. A woman who had too many children too quickly risked dying in childbirth, or losing her status in the home due to exhaustion and poor health. A man whose wife could not bear children after several years might be legally allowed, sometimes obligated, to take a second wife or concubine. Here we begin to see the intertwining of personal life and legal obligation. Marriage contracts from the Old Babylonian period often contained fertility clauses. These were not written with cruelty, but with clarity. If after 2 or 3 years the union remained childless, the husband could marry again, or the wife could agree to bring in a concubine, but the contract often protected the wife's dignity, ensuring that her status in the household remained intact, and her children, if born later, would retain full rights. Concubinage was not merely tolerated, it was systematized. A concubine could be brought in to bear children on behalf of the wife. In such cases, children were often adopted by the primary wife, and the concubine's role diminished after childbearing. It sounds transactional, and it was, but it also reveals a society trying to solve the central problem of human continuity without abandoning order or dignity. Adoption also served as a planning tool. Couples who could not conceive might adopt. An orphan or even a relative's child, formalized through a witnessed contract and often tied to inheritance rights. The adopted child became fully integrated into the household. Another way Mesopotamians maintained the structure and future of the family line when nature did not cooperate. But beyond legal contracts, there were softer methods of control. Natural and social and archaeological evidence and temple records suggest that certain herbs, resins, and techniques were used for both encouraging and discouraging fertility. Silphium, rue, and pennyroyal, known in other ancient societies for their contraceptive properties, may have played a role in Mesopotamian herbal knowledge as well. However, documentation is scarce and often cloaked in metaphor. Texts refer to closing the womb or cleansing the seed, hinting at practices but never detailing them explicitly. We do know that midwives were skilled, respected figures. Many were attached to temples and likely trained through observation and oral transmission. They not only delivered babies, but also provided advice on spacing births, managing miscarriages, and supporting maternal recovery. The quiet work of these women helped shape the rhythm of reproduction, not as a random act of biology, but as a community-managed process. This sense of societal involvement stretched even into religion. Fertility gods and goddesses, Ishtar, Ninhursag, Enki, were worshipped with devotion and anxiety. Childlessness was considered a sign of imbalance, but not necessarily punishment. Rather, it was seen as a condition to be negotiated through prayer, offering, and sometimes public rituals. In one tablet from the city of Mari, a woman writes to her husband, "I have gone again to the temple of Ishtar. I have left bread and fruit. May she hear me, for still no child comes." The letter is brief, but full of longing. It reminds us that even in a world of contracts and clauses, hope and sorrow lived side by side. Yet, for all this careful planning, life in Mesopotamia was still unpredictable. Famine, war, disease, all could undo even the most precise arrangements. And so families hedged their bets. Many aimed for 2 or 3 children, spacing them through custom, contract, or quiet knowledge. Some failed and bore more than they could manage. Others lost children early and tried again, each birth carrying both promise and risk. It is tempting to view such practices as cold or impersonal. But look closer, and you'll see something else. An early civilization's attempt to impose order on the chaos of biology and survival. The tools were different. Clay tablets instead of family planners, midwives instead of doctors, altars instead of clinics. But the questions were the same. When should we have a child? Can we afford one more? And what happens to our home, our name, when we are gone? These questions haunted the quiet courtyards of Mesopotamia as surely as they do bedrooms and kitchens today. And they were answered, in their way, with a mix of pragmatism, ritual, and hope. In the temples and marketplaces of ancient Mesopotamia, the rhythm of daily life pulsed quietly beneath grand ziggurats and dusty rooftops. Yet, it was within the private confines of homes, mud brick dwellings with woven mats and clay hearths, that the most important decisions about family took shape. The seemingly mundane act of deciding how many children to raise and how to secure their futures became an evolving art of legal foresight, social custom, and economic calculation. The roots of this practicality were planted deep in Mesopotamia's material reality. Life in the Fertile Crescent was never truly easy. Floods could erase harvests. Invasions could topple dynasties. Disease could sweep through crowded city quarters. And so, each new child had to be carefully considered, not just as a gift or burden, but as a possible shift in the balance of survival. Economic class played a decisive role. Among the wealthy merchant class and urban elites, families who owned land, livestock, or shipping rights, the management of lineage was a matter of long-term strategy. Sons inherited property, yes, but also responsibility. Too many sons meant divided estates, weakened influence, and sometimes internal conflict. Too few sons, and the family risked vanishing into irrelevance within a generation. To navigate this tension, inheritance contracts became more nuanced. Father might designate his eldest son as Shaknu, the executor of the family estate, while distributing lesser plots or trade rights to younger sons. In return, the Shaknu would be expected to provide for widowed mothers and unmarried sisters. These arrangements were carefully recorded on clay tablets and stored in family archives or temple repositories. A broken contract could lead to legal action, family shame, or even exile from the community. Daughters, too, were folded into the calculus of family planning, but with different terms. In many cities, particularly in Sumer and early Babylon, daughters could inherit if no sons survived, but more commonly, their future was secured through marriage contracts. These agreements often included dowries, baskets of grain, bolts of cloth, or small plots of land, and occasionally post-marital stipulations. One clause might specify that the daughter could return home with her dowry if the marriage was dissolved. Another might bind her sons to the grandfather's lineage, not the husband's. And sometimes, a daughter's fate was shaped by religion. In wealthier families, one daughter might be offered to the temple, not as a nun in the modern sense, but as a nadatu, a woman devoted to the deity, often Ishtar or Shamash, who lived apart from men and held property independently. These women did not marry or bear children, but their status could elevate the family spiritually and socially. In some cases, they adopted children from within the family line, ensuring their wealth and influence remained active, even without biological heirs. But family planning in Mesopotamia wasn't merely about heirs and property. It was also about timing. Spacing of children, while not rigidly controlled, followed observable patterns, likely influenced by postpartum practices, cultural expectations, and perhaps informal contraceptive methods. One likely method was prolonged breastfeeding, which could suppress ovulation and delay subsequent pregnancies, a natural form of spacing observed in many ancient and modern communities. There is no surviving manual of birth control in Mesopotamian literature, but the silence is telling in its own way. Fertility management was woven into custom, whispered advice, and ritual, not codified in temple scrolls. A woman might receive herbs from an elder midwife. A man might visit a shrine to offer incense in hopes of a boy, or in quiet fear that another child would come too soon. Behind these practices were midwives and healers who straddled the line between domestic caretakers and local authorities. Typical midwife in Mesopotamia might assist in 30 or 40 births over the course of her life, often working with the same families across generations. She knew the signs of a difficult labor. She recognized when a mother's health would not bear another child. She could recommend herbal mixtures for pain or recovery, or suggest a month of ritual seclusion to prevent another quick conception. The names of these women rarely appear in the cuneiform record, but their fingerprints are everywhere. In the survival of fragile mothers, in the spacing of births, in the slow but deliberate decisions made in dusty kitchens and shadowed courtyards. And behind the midwives were the temples, ever watchful. Temples were not only centers of worship, but massive bureaucratic hubs, managing land, labor, and grain distribution. They kept census records and received reports of births, deaths, and marriages. Priests and scribes worked in tandem to maintain equilibrium, not just spiritual, but demographic. In some regions, temple scribes maintained annual household rolls. These listed heads of households, the number of dependents, and what portion of communal land or rations they were owed. Too many dependents might strain temple distribution systems. Too few, and fields went untilled. Quietly, over decades, temple officials began to encourage certain practices, not by decree, but by suggestion. Some families received more barley if they hosted orphans. Others were gently reminded that their food allotment was fixed, regardless of how many children they produced. It was a soft hand of policy, not coercion, but quiet pressure. In the countryside, far from the ziggurats and urban granaries, family planning took on a different flavor. Rural families were more vulnerable to crop failure, banditry, and isolation. As a result, their planning strategies were shaped more by need than by contract. Older children were crucial for fieldwork. A son might marry earlier and bring his wife into the homestead to increase labor. A daughter might be promised in exchange for oxen or tools. Children, in this context, were both mouths to feed and arms to harvest. Still, even here, restraint appeared. Archaeological surveys show modest home sizes, usually with space for 5 to 8 people. Graves rarely include more than 2 or 3 children. The absence of large family compounds suggests that even when the land could support more mouths, families aimed for balance, not abundance. It was a survival instinct, refined by generations. All of this, urban contracts, temple records, rural customs, points to a single conclusion. Family planning in Mesopotamia was not a matter of ideology or doctrine. It was a quiet negotiation between hope and resource, desire and reality. Each child born was both a joy and a gamble. Each marriage contract was both a celebration and a calculation. And still, some questions linger. How much agency did women truly have in these negotiations? Did they whisper their wishes to midwives, or bury their preferences beneath obedience and silence? What fears did they carry between one child and the next? And when they chose, if they ever could choose, to stop growing their families, did they find peace in that decision? The answers lie not in law codes or epic poems, but in the invisible spaces of history. The gaps between clay tablets, the pauses in temple records, the erased footprints of ordinary lives. When you look at the vast cityscapes of ancient Mesopotamia, Lagash, Babylon, it's easy to get distracted by the grandeur, ziggurats reaching toward the heavens, canals threading through fields like lifelines, and tablets carved with laws and hymns. But beneath that monumental surface was the day-to-day machinery of survival, stitched together by human choices. And, perhaps the quietest, yet most influential of all those choices, was how families were shaped. By the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BCE, family law had become even more formalized. King Hammurabi's law code, perhaps the most famous document of its kind, addressed marriage, inheritance, adultery, and the rights of wives and children. While it wasn't the first or only code of its kind, it gives us a glimpse into how the state tried to define the boundaries of family life and, by extension, manage population growth, property, and stability. For instance, Hammurabi's laws included clauses that protected wives if a husband failed to provide for them, allowed divorce in cases of illness or infertility, and even permitted women to remarry if their husbands disappeared during military service. These laws didn't promote romantic ideals of marriage, but they did prioritize practical outcomes. If a man left and didn't return, his wife was not to remain in legal limbo. She was to remarry and, implicitly, realign her household into productivity. Even more telling were the laws that governed inheritance and adoption. If a man had no sons, he could adopt one, often an adult male, who would take on the family name, work the land, and care for the parents in old age. These adoptions were not born of sentiment, but of strategy. Keeping the household intact was a sacred duty. The continuity of land use, temple offerings, and ancestral rituals required someone to be in place. In that sense, a son was less about birth and more about obligation. Some families even arranged mock adoptions of sons-in-law, formally naming them as heirs and inserting them into the household with legal backing. This ensured that property wouldn't revert to the temple or the state if a bloodline ran dry. In a society where the household was the core unit of labor and spiritual life, this was essential. It also meant that, contrary to popular belief, family planning didn't always revolve around birth. It could be managed through adoption, alliances, and legal contracts. This flexibility allowed families to respond to misfortune, whether infertility, early deaths, or unexpected loss of land, without losing social standing or security. It was not a world where only biology mattered. Structure mattered more. In the poorer quarters of cities, however, where scribes were few and temple priests distant, things were less precise. Families here had fewer options, fewer tablets to inscribe their wills, fewer goats to barter for good marriages, fewer hands to help at harvest. They leaned instead on kin networks and custom. Grandmothers shared child-rearing duties. Brothers and cousins shared houses. Informal agreements replaced written contracts. Children were still planned for, but less in the legal sense, and more in the visceral daily rhythm of making do. Even so, restraint appeared again. Infant mortality rates were high, but not so high as to suggest uncontrolled fertility. Rather, many families seemed to hover around replacement-level size. 2 or 3 surviving children per household was common. This was not necessarily by deliberate control, but by a combination of experience, environment, and unspoken knowledge. Women, in particular, played a central but often invisible role in this balancing act. Their voices are largely absent from the clay record, but their fingerprints are everywhere. It was women who nursed children for months or years, spacing births without ever uttering the term birth control. It was women who brewed teas from pomegranate rinds and pennyroyal, who understood that fertility could be shaped, gently, discreetly, sometimes out of desperation. And it was women who passed these practices down, in whispers and actions, generation to generation. In a rare surviving medical text, part ritual, part remedy, there's a passage that describes how to stop unwanted conception. The ingredients are vague, the method strange. But it exists, which means someone asked the question. Someone looked for a way to choose. There's no evidence of punishment for such choices. No Mesopotamian equivalent of a moral panic. Instead, the silence around it suggests tolerance. The gods had their domain, but family was a human concern, and humans, even then, were learning how to negotiate their desires, needs, and limitations. Temples may have tracked population, kings may have written laws, but families, Mothers and fathers, uncles and midwives, managed their size through custom, care, and quiet calculation, and sometimes through loss. Burial records from the era are filled with small graves, children who didn't survive their first winters, infants wrapped in cloth and placed beneath thresholds or in shared tombs. These deaths were not statistics to them. They were deep wounds, and over time, perhaps, they shaped the caution with which families approached the decision to have more children, the choice to wait, the need to plan, not only for food or inheritance, but for heartbreak, which brings us to the final lesson of Mesopotamian family planning. Its emotional cost. There were no ultrasound scans or parental leave policies, but there was still longing, there was still grief, and there was the same impossible balance we face today between wanting to nurture life and fearing we might not be able to sustain it. The Mesopotamians didn't solve the problem of family planning, but they approached it with the tools they had: contracts, customs, care. They left us tablets and ruins, but also a quiet message beneath the dust. That even 4,000 years ago, people asked the same questions we ask today. Is this the right time for a child? Do we have enough to offer? What happens to those left behind? And what, in the end, is a family, but a shared effort to endure? From the cradles they carved in clay to the contracts they etched in stone, the people of ancient Mesopotamia left behind a story, not of rulers or wars, but of choices. Choices made in kitchens and courtyards. Choices shaped by scarcity, love, and the slow, deliberate rhythm of ordinary life. And when you look at those records, fragments of agreements, tiny footprints in tombs, and fading symbols on clay, you begin to see them not as strangers from a distant past, but as reflections. Human, fragile, calculating, and tender, just like us. The Han dynasty did not build its empire on swords alone, nor was it held together simply by the philosophies of Confucius or the sprawling trade routes of the Silk Road. It endured because it counted every person, every acre, every ox. The rulers of Han China, beginning in 206 BCE, inherited a chaotic empire from the Qin, one that had crumbled under its own weight. The Han emperors, cautious but ambitious, learned a lesson from that collapse. Power required knowledge, not just the knowledge of enemies or astronomy, but the knowledge of people, who they were, where they lived, what they owned, and what they owed. And so, quietly, persistently, they began counting. The first national census in recorded human history was conducted under Emperor Ping in Sekou CE. The numbers were staggering. Nearly 60 million people documented, households tallied, occupations noted, births recorded. Even in an era without typewriters or carbon paper, the imperial administration managed to catalogue the lives of its citizens with obsessive precision. But this was not modern bureaucracy. There were no rows of grey desks or humming fluorescents. Instead, there were bamboo slips, thin, flat strips of wood bundled together with cords. These were the scrolls of the Han administration, each one a page in the quiet story of an empire held together by ink, effort, and dusty travel. The census was managed through a system of local officials called Li and Ting, each responsible for small village clusters. These village leaders did not simply tally heads. They knew their people. They were neighbors, not strangers. And in this closeness lay both strength and fragility. On one hand, it ensured accurate records. On the other, it created pressure, because no one wanted to underreport or overstep in front of someone they saw every morning at the well. Each household was required to submit annual reports detailing the number of residents, their ages, their occupations, and, critically, their land. This was not abstract data. It was used to determine taxes, military service, and even marriage eligibility. A household with 2 strong sons might be asked to contribute 1 to the border guard. A family with excess land could face heavier taxation or suspicion. But here's the part often missed in the pages of dynastic history. This wasn't just about the empire knowing its people. It was about people knowing the empire knew them. There was a kind of quiet contract between citizen and state, sealed not by ink, but by rhythm. Every spring, the forms were filled. Every autumn, the taxes collected. And in between, life was, lived in a delicate balance between obligation and survival. Family planning, in this context, was not merely personal, it was political. A household with too many children might struggle under its tax burden. One with too few might lose its land to relatives or neighbors. The pressure to maintain just enough mouths to work the fields, but not so many as to strain the rice pot, was constant. And it played out not in dramatic edicts, but in decisions made around fire pits and fields. Have another child this year? Or wait until the harvest proves itself? What complicates the story is how flexible the system had to be. For example, widows could request reduced taxes. Households decimated by disease might be granted reprieve. But this only worked if the records were accurate, and accuracy depended on trust. That trust often rested with local scribes, quiet, overworked men who carried bundles of bamboo and tiny brushes, knocking on doors and peering into lives. It's easy to imagine them, walking narrow lanes between paddy fields, sleeves rolled, sweat-staining collars, politely asking for the year's update. How many children now? Any new livestock? How is the old mother's health? These were not invasive questions in the way we think of modern surveillance. They were expected, necessary, part of the pulse of life under the Han. And yet, mistakes happened. A man might report his son as 10 when he was 12, avoiding conscription for another year. A widow might hide her remarriage to keep tax relief. A family might inflate its land yield to appear prosperous. But the state had its ways, inspections, cross-checks, gossip, because in villages, secrets don't last long. Still, what's remarkable is not the failure of the system, but its success. For over 2 centuries, Han China maintained a functional census apparatus that allowed it to feed armies, build roads, and survive famine. It wasn't glamorous. There were no poets writing odes to census scrolls, but there was stability. And in a land constantly threatened by drought, rebellion, and war, that stability was priceless. It's important to pause here and note, the Han dynasty was not trying to control family size in the way modern governments have. There were no quotas, no forced measures. Instead, the counting itself became a kind of soft influence. It nudged people toward balance. Households learned to shape themselves according to what they could afford and what they would be taxed for. In that sense, the scrolls weren't just records. They were mirrors. They reflected the rhythms of birth and death, of marriage and migration. They captured the shape of life in a way that modern databases can't quite match, because they were built from human hands and human memory. And they forced every person, every spring, to think not just of today, but of tomorrow. Not just of family pride, but of family cost. So, the question lingered in every home, whispered after meals, debated at market. Should we have another child this year? Or is it better to wait, to hold the line, to protect what we have, even if it means giving up what could be? Because in Han China, every birth was a blessing, but every birth was also a number. And in a world run by bamboo slips, that number meant everything. 1,000 miles away from the imperial court, where banners snapped in the wind and bronze bells marked the hours, the work of the census continued. Quieter, slower, and deeply human. Out in the rice villages and hill towns of Han China, the counting was not abstract, it was personal, and it was never quite finished. Each year, local officials, scribes, assistants, sometimes even monks, made their rounds with bundles of bamboo slips and ink brushes tucked into their sleeves. These weren't bureaucrats in the modern sense. Many were village-born themselves. They knew the families they recorded. They had played as children in the same dusty lanes, bartered in the same markets, buried parents under the same ancestral trees. That intimacy gave the system both strength and strain. The census was called the Yellow Register, a name that came from the hue of the slips used in certain regions. These bamboo slips, tied with string and inscribed with delicate brushwork, were the backbone of state knowledge. One household per entry: father, mother, children, occupation, age, status, property, draft obligations, livestock, if any, illnesses, if relevant. These simple details formed the foundation of state policy, from military recruitment to famine relief. But more than that, the Yellow Register told the story of how families were expected to function, and how they often had to adapt to survive. Let's imagine one such household, a modest farming family in the province of Jing. A father in his late 40s, a mother 2 years younger, 3 sons, 2 daughters, a small patch of rice fields near the river, a water buffalo, and a worn but serviceable cart. Last year's entry had noted the second son's marriage, and now, this year, a new line. Child born, winter, male. It seemed minor, but it shifted everything. That birth meant an additional mouth to feed. It also meant that in a few short years, the family's labor obligations would rise. If the father grew too old to meet the local corvée, the required days of unpaid state labor, one of the sons would be expected to take his place. But if the family had too many dependents, too few working-age men, they could be granted temporary relief. This math of people was not just the state's math, it was the family's. That's where the register gained its quiet power. It encouraged households to think about themselves in terms of balance. Who was earning, who was eating, who was old enough to serve, and who might soon be too old to walk to the fields. Families shaped themselves around these realities, often making difficult choices. Sometimes the old were sent to live with married daughters. Sometimes daughters were married earlier than planned to reduce tax burdens. Sometimes, if a child died in infancy, it was not reported at all, not out of deceit, but out of grief and shame. The line was left blank, the brush hesitated, and the state never knew. The Yellow Register didn't punish these choices, but it did reveal patterns. One such pattern began to trouble the imperial advisors in Luoyang, the eastern capital. In several frontier provinces, families were shrinking. Births were being delayed. Fertility rates, although not measured with modern terms, were noticeably dipping. Local governors sent letters to the court, speculating. Was it the soil, the cost of marriage, the fear of banditry? In truth, it was likely a combination. But one thread emerged consistently: the burden of the scroll. Families, it seemed, were responding to pressure. Every child born meant higher taxes later. Every new daughter needed a dowry someday, and so, quietly, a culture of hesitation had taken hold. To combat this, the state began to offer small incentives. Families with 3 sons were promised reduced military service. Those with multiple daughters were sometimes given grain subsidies. Midwives were encouraged to report live births. Small, simple levers, but levers all the same. In villages, the scribes began to notice a curious change. Some families started spacing their children more carefully. Others quietly adopted orphans, counting them as dependents to gain tax relief. A few even falsified registers, claiming elders as invalids or young sons as still too small for labor. The empire responded with audits. Traveling inspectors, often scholars trained at the Imperial Academy, were sent to sample random villages, compare local records, and offer corrective advice. These visits were not always welcomed. To some villagers, they felt like invasions. To others, they were a chance to petition, to explain why they had misreported, to beg for forgiveness or revision. One inspector's bamboo scroll survives today, miraculously preserved in a tomb. It's dry and cracked, but legible. On it are the notes from a single village. 13 households, 82 people. Of those, 20 were children under 5. 2 households had no children at all. One was led by a widow who had taken in her niece's orphaned daughters. Another included a blind grandfather listed as a non-productive dependent. The scroll is dull by modern standards. It does not tell of wars or emperors, but it does tell of care. It shows that the state, for all its harshness and rigidity, recognized the lives of ordinary people. It knew that family size was not just a number. It was a strategy, a legacy, a negotiation between hope and reality. This didn't make life easier. The counting could be relentless. Some scribes began to report burnout. Others vanished from the records, likely having moved or died. Still, the registers grew thicker year after year. By 100 CE, a new census was underway. This time, it included details about illnesses, soil quality, and migration. The empire had grown wiser. It understood now that people could not be counted like grains of rice. They had to be tracked like rivers, flowing, shifting, always, moving towards some unknown future. And so the scrolls evolved. No longer just a tool for taxation, they became a blueprint for planning. But in that planning lay a deeper question, one that families, year after year, had to ask themselves: are we growing too much or not enough? The winter of Tewadu CE was colder than expected. Snow fell early across much of the northern provinces of Han China, blanketing villages, slowing travel, and silencing fields that had just been harvested. In Luoyang, officials huddled, inside the imperial archives, brushing off their sleeves and heating their inkstones beside charcoal braziers. Outside, the empire slept uneasily. But inside the Bureau of Population and Land, the scrolls were still being unrolled, examined, compared. This was the beginning of what would become one of the most ambitious census efforts in ancient history. Under the direction of Emperor Ping and his regents, the imperial court launched a complete population count that aimed not just to tally the living, but to measure the empire's pulse, its stability, its future, its burdens. The census of 2 CE would, remarkably, go on to record a population of nearly 60 million people, a figure astonishingly precise for the time, and one that would remain unmatched in accuracy for more than 1,000 years. But behind that number lay something far more intricate. Not simply the act of counting, but the delicate process of shaping a future through those counts. You see, the census wasn't just about numbers. It was about managing people's expectations, inheritance, and continuity. And at the heart of it all was the Chinese family. Multi-generational, deeply rooted, and bound together by tradition and necessity. Inheritance laws in Han China were pragmatic but deeply moral. Land was divided equally among sons, ensuring fairness, but also, inadvertently, ensuring fragmentation. Over time, as families grew and generations expanded, plots of land became thinner, narrower, harder to farm. This created tension. How could a family maintain dignity, status, and survival when the land beneath their feet was slowly vanishing? The state recognized this dilemma, and the census became a tool to anticipate it. For example, a household with 3 sons, 1 married, 2 approaching adulthood, might receive advice from local officials about long-term land use. If their land was too small to divide evenly, they were encouraged to seek employment with regional bureaus, join state-sponsored granary cooperatives, or in rare cases, migrate to border regions where land was more plentiful. This wasn't enforced by threat, at least not directly. It was bureaucratically nudged. Grain loans were made easier for households that agreed to split early. Draft service might be delayed for sons who agreed to leave home for imperial projects. The census scrolls made it possible. They showed who had what, who needed help, and who just might become a problem later if balance wasn't restored. But this raised difficult questions within households. Who would stay? Who would go? And who had the right to decide? Let's return to a household in the province of Shu, near what is now Sichuan. A father, now 63, has 3 sons. His rice paddies are fertile but limited. The eldest son is already married with 2 children. The second helps on the farm. The third, clever, strong, unmarried, is offered a position in a census bureau far away in the north. The father hesitates. To send the son is to lose help. To keep him is to risk future division. The family debates. A village elder is consulted. In the end, the son departs, taking with him a woven bag, a sealed travel permit, and the memory of long conversations held beside a smoky hearth. His name, scratched onto a fresh bamboo slip, now appears in another province's census. A simple move, but it ripples. The family, now adjusted to 2 sons, rethinks its planting strategy. The younger children take on more tasks. The grandfather dies the next year. His name, once marked alive, non-laboring, is scratched out. The property is slightly easier to divide now. And when the next census is conducted 5 years later, the balance has shifted. Again, these little adjustments were invisible to outsiders, but to the families who lived them, they were survival. Meanwhile, back in Luoyang, scholars and ministers reviewed scrolls with increasing sophistication. Statistical methods began to emerge, crude by today's standards but revolutionary for their time. Patterns were noted: birth spikes after drought relief, population dips following floods, marriage age trends shifting in grain-poor years. Even more subtle trends emerged. Households with elderly parents and no grandchildren tended to merge with others. Widows often rejoined maiden households, especially when land was scarce. Local officials used this data to suggest seasonal migration, to design tax breaks for adoptive families, and to draft public works projects that quietly absorbed surplus young men. In essence, the empire learned to breathe with its people, expanding and contracting, reshaping itself in response to the delicate, invisible rhythms of family life. And through it all, the census scrolls remained unglamorous. They didn't sing of conquest or epic battles. They didn't record poetry or legend, but they captured something arguably more important: the real calculations that ordinary people made to survive year after year, generation after generation. By the late Han period, the census had become a tradition, almost sacred in its own way. A ritual of ink and string, repeated across thousands of villages. Each slip whispered the same question: who are you now? And who will you be when this is read again? Many of those bamboo slips have long since crumbled, lost to fire, time, war, but their impact remains, not in monuments or ruins, but in the way they helped shape a civilization that saw families not just as private matters, but as threads in the fabric of an empire. The census was, in the end, more than a count. It was a mirror. It showed a society trying to balance duty and compassion, order and change, legacy and hope. And in the quiet spaces between brushstrokes, it left behind the faint outline of millions of lives not famous, not powerful, but essential. People who didn't build empires, but held them together. One family decision, one line at a time. Imagine a quiet morning in the Roman countryside sometime around 140 CE. The sun is rising slowly over low hills outside a small settlement in the province of Umbria. The farmsteads are modest, stone cottages, tiled roofs patched with thatch, olive trees lining dusty paths. There's no marble, no columns, no senators in sight. Just a man waking before dawn, scratching at his beard, reaching for a heavy, woolen tunic. His name is Gaius. He is not a patrician, not a soldier, not even a city merchant. He is a colonus, a tenant farmer, like tens of thousands of others in the Roman Empire. And today, he's thinking not of ploughing or pruning, but of a more pressing problem. What will happen to his land and tools when he dies? In the grand narratives of Roman history, we often hear of emperors and generals, of conquest and law, of battles and oration. But beneath that grand sweep lay a quieter, more fragile system: the rural legacy laws, the way ordinary Romans passed their modest property, livestock, and debts from one generation to the next. For men like Gaius, legacy wasn't about villas or libraries. It was about a mule, a plot of vines, and a shovel worn smooth by years of calloused hands. And yet, losing any of those, or passing them to the wrong person, could destroy a family's livelihood overnight. That's where the Roman concept of testamentum came in, the will. But for rural Romans, it wasn't so simple. Urban elites had notaries, scribes, and access to libraries full of legal precedents. But out in the provinces, many people were illiterate. Instead of parchment, many rural wills were spoken aloud, in front of witnesses, often neighbors or village elders, and remembered until they could be committed to writing by a traveling official. In Gaius's village, a traveling tabularius, a scribe, visits only once or twice a year. So for most people, a will is a series of spoken oaths, remembered and passed down by others, trusted to local community memory as much as to the law itself. This oral tradition created challenges. What if a neighbor misremembered? What if a cousin objected after the death? What if the deceased left behind only daughters or children still too young to claim land? Here, the Roman legal system, surprisingly for its time, offered flexibility. For rural citizens, the law recognized the need to adapt. There were mechanisms for guardianship, adoption, co-heirship, and even posthumous transfers, all tailored to ensure that small farms once built didn't fall apart due to bureaucracy. One of the more overlooked legal tools was the familia rusticorum, the informal designation of heirs not by blood, but by utility. If Gaius had no sons, but a nephew who helped him plough for 10 years, he could name that nephew his principal heir so long as the community recognized the labor and relationship. It wasn't always accepted by Roman patrician standards, but in the countryside, practicality often overruled blood. This system allowed rural Rome to function despite instability. With no central banking, few written contracts, and limited state oversight, the will of the farmer became a miniature constitution, binding not just the family, but the wider community. But there was risk, because if a will wasn't witnessed, or if it contradicted other arrangements, it could be contested. And when it was, the ashes of old grievances tended to flare up. Consider a case recorded in a provincial court archive from Hispania in 152 CE. A farmer, long since dead, had passed his land to his daughter, something technically allowed, but only under certain conditions. A distant male cousin, citing ancestral rights, challenged the will, claiming she had no right to own ploughed land as an unmarried woman. The village split. Some elders remembered the father's declaration. Others sided with the cousin. The dispute ended not in court, but in compromise. The land was divided, and the daughter retained the home, but lost the fields. It was a reminder that Roman inheritance law was as much about people as about precedent. The ashes in this story weren't just metaphorical. Roman burial practices often involved cremation, especially in earlier centuries. The funeral urn held more than just remains. It was the symbolic marker of continuity, the point where legacy began. In rural Rome, the urn was often placed near the home or in a small grove, a reminder not only of mortality but of obligation. To pass by your father's ashes daily was to be reminded of what you owed and what had been passed to you. That urn might have held only bones, but it also held expectations to maintain the land, to protect your kin, to uphold your father's wishes even if you had no parchment to prove them. Over time, these informal legacies began to be supplemented by more formal ones. By the late 2nd century, Roman authorities had started deploying more itinerant scribes to the provinces, helping standardize local wills. But even then, the process remained deeply personal. A farmer might dictate a will in a cramped corner of a tavern, his calloused hands wrapped around a cup of warm wine, while the scribe scratched the words onto wax tablets. Witnesses were gathered, not lawyers but neighbors, and a thumbprint sealed the deal. And then, as with so many things in Roman history, life simply went on. The plough returned to the soil. The mule was fed. Children ran through olive groves. And somewhere on a shelf or inside a leather satchel, a will rested, quietly defining the next generation's rights and risks. These weren't grand dramas. They weren't celebrated by poets or painted on frescoes, but they were history in its most invisible form. So next time we think of Roman law, of emperors drafting decrees on scrolls of silk, remember the simpler truth that somewhere in a sun-dappled corner of the empire, an old man sat on a stone step, thinking of what little he had and who would carry it after he was gone. And that moment was the true heart of Roman inheritance. In the years following Gaius's death, the implications of his spoken will began to ripple across his quiet Umbrian village. His nephew, Lucius, not a blood heir by strict patrilineal standards, but long considered like a son by the old man, began to manage the land, yet whispers stirred. A second cousin, Marcus, returned from military service near the Danube, tan from foreign sun and clutching a brittle wax tablet he claimed held a legal claim to the property. He had never worked the fields, nor sat by the hearth when Gaius took ill, nor offered tribute during the older man's cremation. But he had something Lucius didn't. A document bearing a provincial seal, albeit one dated 10 years earlier, and possibly never updated. This was the fracture point in rural Roman law, the place where written imperial procedure collided with unwritten communal memory. You see, Roman law was deeply layered. At the top, there was the ius civile, the formal civic law of Roman citizens. Then came ius gentium, laws of broader application across the empire. And below that, far below, there lived a third realm, custom. For villages like Gaius's, it was customary law that truly governed daily life. Legal scholars rarely visited. Judges were often military officers doubling as local administrators. And so, what the neighbours believed mattered just as much as what a dusty clerk in Ravenna might have once stamped. Marcus's document, though impressive, was outdated. It named him co-heir when he was still a teenager, during a period when Gaius had no children and Lucius was a distant figure. Since then, Lucius had returned, repaired the roof, replanted the vines, and cared for Gaius as age took its toll. Yet Roman law had no statute of limitations in inheritance matters, not in the way modern systems do. If Marcus could prove his document was genuine and never formally rescinded, he had a legal claim, no matter how estranged he'd been. So the village assembled, not in a marble forum, but in a shaded grove near the community well. The local magistratus, vicinalis, a kind of honorary elder and informal mediator, listened as neighbours stood to speak. One by one, they affirmed that Lucius had been chosen, that Gaius had spoken of him, day after day, as the one who will take my ashes forward. That phrase mattered. In many Roman rural communities, legacy wasn't written into scrolls, it was spoken in the rites of death. To inherit a farm was not just to claim its olive trees and tools, it was to take on sacra privata, the private sacred duties of the household. Every Roman family had its lairs and penates, its guardian spirits and ancestral shrines. Caring for them wasn't optional. It was a civic and spiritual obligation. Lucius had lit the funeral pyre. He had poured the oil. He had collected the ashes and placed them in a humble terracotta urn beneath the fig tree beside the house. That act alone, in many villagers' minds, sealed the inheritance. This concept of inheritance through ritual was deeply embedded in Roman peasant life. While Roman courts might demand signatures and stamps, rural Rome honoured presence over paperwork. If you took care of the body, you took care of the land. But Marcus insisted. He marched with the document to the municipal court in nearby Spolitium, where a local official, trained in Roman law but aware of village custom, reviewed the complaint. And here, Roman bureaucracy once again showed its strange brilliance and quiet flexibility. Rather than issue a verdict, the official called for a confirmatio testamentaria vicina, a neighbourhood confirmation of testamentary wishes. It was a legal workaround, allowing a community consensus to supplement, and in some cases override, incomplete legal documents. This process required that 7 witnesses testify under oath regarding the deceased's spoken intentions. They had to confirm that Lucius had been named as heir, that Gaius had revoked the older document, or at least had replaced it through action and word. It was a dangerous gamble. Perjury carried heavy penalties, up to infamy, the legal loss of reputation and rights. But 7 villagers, including a midwife, a beekeeper, and the innkeeper's son, stood and swore. The magistrate signed a new tablet. Marcus's claim was formally declined. Lucius inherited everything, not only the land, but the debts, the old tools, the 3-legged mule named Fulvus, and the responsibility to maintain the rights and pay any owed taxes. In Roman rural law, you couldn't cherry-pick an inheritance. You took it all, or you took nothing. Yet, even after winning, Lucius faced challenges. Inheritance meant managing not just the estate, but also its history. A neighbor had a boundary dispute. Gaius had promised him a row of olive saplings in exchange for labor. No written note existed. Another man claimed Gaius owed him 4 sestertii for wine purchased during a festival. A debt remembered, not recorded. Lucius did what most heirs in rural Rome did. He called a convivium, a shared meal. He invited those with grievances, offered bread, oil, and wine, and worked out small settlements. An extra jug of oil here, a few amphorae of grain there. No court would record these dealings, but the community would remember. This system of negotiation, compromise, and shared memory was how Roman inheritance worked for the vast majority of the population. For every senator drafting a will in marble halls, there were 100 farmers making decisions in orchards, over firelight, with hands that smelled of garlic and ash. Legacy law in rural Rome wasn't about estates. It was about equilibrium, about maintaining enough stability that farms didn't fracture, families didn't feud, and children didn't starve. And yet, even with all these rituals and customs, no legacy was permanent. In the decades after Lucius took ownership, Rome's economic tides shifted. Taxes rose, markets dried up, the empire lurched toward instability. The olive grove was sold, then repurchased. A drought ruined the barley one year. The boundary stones shifted again, and Fulvus, the old mule, finally lay down beneath the fig tree and never rose again. Lucius buried him near the urn, out of respect. He added a second stone. The land endured, but the family changed. Names faded. Only the stones remained. By the end of his life, Lucius had come to understand that inheritance wasn't a moment. It was a slow unfolding, a dialogue between the living and the dead, between the present and the persistent whisper of the past. His days were spent tending to the land, but his nights often brought other matters. Beneath the low ceiling of his farmhouse, by the light of a smoky oil lamp, Lucius kept a ledger, not of coins or trade, but of promises made and debts quietly repaid, favors exchanged with neighbors, boundaries agreed upon with handshakes, funerals attended, livestock helped through difficult births. It wasn't required by law, but it was essential for legacy. This idea, that inheritance was not a transaction, but a stewardship, was common in the Roman countryside. Villages lacked access to Rome's complex judicial system. In most cases, praetors and scribes never set foot in these areas unless collecting taxes or marching troops. So rural Romans preserved their own unwritten systems. They treated land not as a commodity, but as a continuum. One's duty was to preserve it well enough to pass on, not to profit, but to endure, and endure it did, for another generation at least. Lucius had a daughter, Tullia, a quiet girl who learned the names of each fig tree by heart. She fed the chickens, repaired the granary roof with her father, and memorized the household prayers. But women, in the formal eyes of Roman law, were not usually heirs. A woman might inherit if named in a testamentum, but such arrangements often raised eyebrows, especially in the provinces where tradition ran deeper than legal reform. Lucius faced a problem. He had no sons, no close male relatives. Marcus, The cousin who had once contested the estate had long since vanished into a distant legion. And yet, in every meaningful way, Tullia was the keeper of the home. She knew which jar held the family's sacred salt. She tended the altar where Lucius lit offerings to the Lares. She knew where Gaius's ashes lay and why that fig tree must never be cut down. So Lucius did something both simple and radical. He invited the village elders. He offered them olives, oil, and hard bread. And he spoke aloud, before witnesses, the words that had power in this place. Tullia is the heir. She knows the house. She holds the fire. She keeps the memory. The elders murmured. One or two frowned, but most nodded. There was precedent. Inheritance law had, over time, bent slightly toward the practical. Emperor Augustus himself had expanded rights of inheritance to women who had borne a certain number of children. A law meant to encourage family growth. In Lucius's case, though, it was not imperial reform that guided them, but ritual and trust. The next spring, Lucius died quietly beneath the same roof where he had once sat with Gaius. Tullia prepared his funeral pyre. She gathered dry olive branches and rosemary, recited the household prayers, and placed her father's ashes in a new urn beside the others. No one challenged her claim, not the tax collectors who visited once a year, not the village men who might once have questioned a woman's authority. She had lit the fire, she had kept the house, that was enough. But the world was changing. Across the empire, Rome was beginning its slow, rumbling transformation. The urban elite were codifying more, inheritance law into formal tablets and bureaucratic decrees. Christianity was slowly emerging in whispers and secret symbols, questioning old rites. The legions were stretched thin. Roads became less safe. Grain shipments more erratic. The villages, once tight-knitted and self-governing, found themselves more often at the mercy of imperial officials than their own elders. For a time, Tullia held her ground, but as harvests declined and tax burdens increased, she was forced to lease part of the land to a neighboring family, one with 4 sons and the muscle to maintain the fields. In exchange, she asked only for their promise to maintain the altar, feed the chickens, and let her keep the fig tree untouched. It was not a legal contract. It was a pact of honor. This is how so many rural Roman estates slowly passed out of family hands. Not through war or betrayal, but through necessity and quiet concession. The lineage was not erased, it was folded into another. The urns remained under the tree. The altar still burned on festival days. The stories lived on in the mouths of neighbors, even if the name on the tax roll had changed. By the 5th century, as the Western Empire cracked under pressure from within and without, such customs quietly died away. Latin turned to rustic dialects. Laws once held sacred became obscure. The concept of inheritance became increasingly tied to ecclesiastical authority, as churches and monasteries grew in wealth and influence. The sacred hearths were extinguished, the ancestral urns forgotten. And yet, in remote corners of modern Italy, especially among the older farming families, one still hears whispers of the old ways, of how inheritance is not simply about paperwork or signatures. It's about who buried the father, who lights the fire, who remembers the names. Historians now pore over fragmentary land records, faded funeral inscriptions, and rare surviving wax tablets from the provinces. These small, almost insignificant scraps reveal a Rome we rarely imagine, not the marble empire, but the mud and olive Rome. A world where legacy was humble, deeply personal, and often invisible to the elite, scribes who wrote history. Tullia's name never made it into the records. Her urn is lost. Her altar crumbled. But somewhere, in the quiet curve of a vine-covered hill, perhaps a fig tree still grows. And maybe, just maybe, the ground remembers. In the gentle hush before dawn, a low bell rang out across the cold, stone courtyards of a Benedictine monastery in 12th century France. It was not loud. It did not startle the crows or rouse the village beyond the walls. But for those within, for the monks who slept on straw pallets, wrapped in thin wool, heads shorn and minds trained for obedience, it was a command. Not shouted, not questioned, simply obeyed. This bell, known as the Matins bell, was more than a call to prayer. It was the axis around which the entire life of the monastery revolved. For in these stone enclaves, far from the noise of courts and the chaos of war, power was not wielded through decree or display. It was ritual that ruled, and the hearth at the monastery's heart served as the unspoken symbol of that order. When we imagine medieval Europe, we often think of kings and knights, battles and banners. But for many, especially in rural regions, the most influential institution in daily life was not the crown. It was the monastery. Quiet, disciplined, and often deeply intertwined with the surrounding communities, these places operated on a rhythm utterly foreign to modern ears. There were no hours as we understand them. Instead, time was sliced by bells and prayers. 7 times a day, the monks paused their work, their thoughts, and even their meals to pray. These were the canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, and they carved the day into sacred intervals. At the centre of this timekeeping stood a very real hearth. In the main hall, where meals were taken in silence, and in the warming rooms used in winter, fire was kept alive not just for heat, but as a symbol of constancy. Just as the fire never ceased, so too did the prayers. Each monk's day began in darkness. Rising from his pallet, he pulled on a coarse tunic and walked barefoot or in simple leather sandals across cold stone floors. There was no conversation. There were no choices. His body, his voice, even his thoughts were gradually disciplined into obedience, not from fear, but from a kind of reverence for order. To be a monk was not to disappear from the world, but to be rearranged within it. Breakfast did not exist. After the first set of prayers, work began. Depending on the monastery, this could mean tending the herb gardens, copying manuscripts, brewing ale, illuminating sacred texts, or overseeing the monastery's modest income from nearby farms. Yet every task, no matter how mundane, was infused with the gravity of service. In Cluny, in Monte Cassino, in Lindisfarne, across the vast map of monastic Europe, the same pattern unfolded, quietly replicated year after year, and while abbots theoretically held authority, their power was often more ceremonial than coercive. It was the rule, most famously, the rule of Saint Benedict, that held sway. A document written in the 6th century that dictated everything, from how many times a monk should eat to how to greet a guest at the door. It was detailed, it was repetitive, and it worked. Perhaps what's most remarkable is how this system, so rigid on the surface, created stability in a deeply unstable world. While kings died, lands were raided, and borders shifted, the monasteries remained. The hearth was tended, the bell was rung, the prayers were sung. Even outside the walls, peasants and local lords often depended on the monks not just for spiritual guidance, but for economic and even legal stability. The monastery might be the only place with a library, the only place with trained scribes, or the only institution that kept reliable track of land ownership and births. In a sense, the monastery became an alternative kind of governance, one where laws were not enforced by soldiers, but by routine. Visitors to these places often remarked on their quiet, but it was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of careful structure. You could feel it in the rhythm of footsteps on stone, in the whisper of robes during prayer, in the soft clink of spoons during a silent meal. This was not a life of emptiness, but of finely honed attention, and central to it all was the hearth, not in a dramatic or mythic sense, but in the literal daily reality. Warmth in winter, boiling water for medicine, light by which to write. It was the practical engine of spiritual life. But even in these solemn places, change crept in. By the 12th century, some monasteries had grown wealthy. Land donations from nobles, eager to secure prayers for their souls, flooded the accounts of certain orders. Lavish guest halls were built, gold-trimmed manuscripts appeared, and with wealth came tension. Some monks whispered that the original purpose was being lost, that the quiet hearth was being replaced by ornate altars, that obedience was turning into indulgence. These murmurs would eventually give rise to reform movements like the Cistercians, who sought to return to the austere simplicity of early monastic life. But for now, in our 12th century monastery, the fire still burns steadily. The prayers are chanted in unison. The abbot sits in quiet contemplation, and somewhere in a cramped scriptorium, a young monk sharpens a quill to continue copying the Book of Hours, word by painstaking word. Outside, the world changes. Wars rage, borders shift. Inside, the bell rings again. But what happens when the bells fall silent? What happens to a society when its most reliable timekeepers vanish from the landscape? The monastery's orderliness was its greatest strength, but also its most fragile illusion. For centuries, European monasteries operated like clockwork, unwavering, predictable, nearly immune to the chaos that surrounded them. A monk waking in the 8th century could enter a cloister in the 12th and still recognize the rhythms of life. The bell still rang, the cloisters still echoed with chants, the fire still glowed beneath iron pots in the warming room. But by the High Middle Ages, cracks had begun to form in this careful architecture. The first pressure came not from within, but from wealth. As the centuries passed, monasteries, originally founded on vows of poverty and labor, became unexpected financial centers. Nobles who feared for their souls donated vast tracts of land in exchange for perpetual prayers. Peasants tithed to monasteries as faithfully as they did to lords. Monasteries even acted as banks, storing wealth, lending coin, and collecting interest, all while maintaining a public face of simplicity. Some monks grew uneasy. Could silence and devotion survive prosperity? The tension grew more pronounced in places like Cluny, where the complex had expanded into an architectural wonder. Multiple cloisters, guest halls, vineyards, towers, even lavish dormitories for visiting nobility. The hearth in such a monastery was no longer just a warming stone in the kitchen. It had become a symbol of transformation. What once boiled oats for humble brothers now prepared feasts for high-ranking guests. Inside the monastery walls, life became more layered. There were now distinctions between choir monks, who prayed and copied manuscripts, and lay brothers, who worked the fields, mended clothing, or swept the floors. The rule of Saint Benedict hadn't changed, but its interpretation had been massaged to fit a growing institution. And yet, amidst this wealth, monks still woke before dawn, filed into the cold chapel, and chanted the psalms in unison. It is here that the hearth's deeper metaphor takes root. A quiet, sustained flame, even when the room grows noisy with politics and ambition. But change came from outside as well. By the 13th century, towns were growing, trade was reviving, universities were emerging. The monastery, once the beating heart of knowledge and spiritual authority, found itself slowly eclipsed by new centers of influence. Books were now copied in city workshops, not just in monastic scriptoria. Philosophy, once rooted in the cloister, had migrated to urban lecture halls. Suddenly, the silence of the monastery began to seem quaint, a place of reflection, yes, but no longer the axis of life it once was. To respond, new monastic orders emerged. The Cistercians, led by reformers like Bernard of Clairvaux, returned to austerity. Their monasteries were simple, intentionally placed, far from villages. Their chapels had bare walls. Their fires were modest. They wanted to rekindle the original discipline of simplicity. The hearth here was not symbolic. It was sparse, necessary, and humbling. Elsewhere, a different model arose. Not cloistered monks, But mendicant friars like the Franciscans and Dominicans, these men did not withdraw from the world. They lived in it, preaching in towns, begging for sustenance, and sleeping in modest quarters. For them, the idea of a monastery hearth was replaced by a spiritual fire carried within. And yet, the old monasteries still held on. They still fed the poor, still tended libraries, still raised bees, grew herbs, and served as hospitals for the sick and elderly. In places where law broke down, the abbot's word still settled disputes. In rural Europe, they remained one of the few sources of continuity. It's easy to imagine these institutions as static, unchanging relics. But monasteries adapted constantly. They adjusted the rule to accommodate age, illness, weather, and even politics. During plagues, they opened their doors. During famines, they thinned their stores. And during wars, many became refugees for women, children, and sacred relics. Still, the core remained, a fire that never quite went out, a bell that always rang on time. It is perhaps in the smallest details that their quiet governance is most visible. The monastic scribe, copying legal documents by lamplight, ensuring a peasant's land claim was honoured. The infirmarian, tending to wounds with lavender salves and honey, learned from centuries of herbal study. The cook, carefully rationing the last stores of lentils and dried fish, ensuring no brother went hungry before spring. None of this was grand. None of it made history's front pages. But in the medieval world, where chaos was common and justice often arbitrary, these small acts of order, performed under the glow of a fire and the rhythm of bells, had profound influence. And always, the fire was there. In the warming room where an aging brother came to rest his bones. In the kitchen where broth simmered to feed the sick. In the guest hall where a traveller found shelter from snow. It was not just about heat, it was about presence. But with the rise of Protestant reformers in the 16th century, the final challenge approached. Luther, Calvin, and others questioned the very foundation of monastic life. They asked why men should withdraw from society, why wealth was hoarded behind cloistered walls, why celibacy, silence, and obedience were required to serve God. Monasteries across Europe would soon face suppression, seizure, and dissolution. Fires would be extinguished, bells would go silent. The question then is not just what monks did, but what happened to the world when they no longer did it. In the early 1500s, across much of Europe, monastery doors were closing. What had once been quiet sanctuaries of prayer, order, and steady governance now stood abandoned, confiscated, or burned. The Reformation swept through countries like a harsh winter wind, dousing the warm, persistent fire that had quietly glowed in monasteries for nearly 1,000 years. But to understand what was lost, we must look again at what those fires once sustained. When King Henry VIII began the dissolution of the monasteries in England between 1536 and 1541, it wasn't just about theology, it was also about land. Monasteries held nearly a quarter of the country's wealth, and by tearing them down, the crown gained enormous property, much of which was sold to nobles, enriching a new political class. But for common people, the effects were immediate and unsettling. The monastery had not just been a place of chanting monks and stone cloisters. It had been a community pillar. It provided food to the hungry, herbs to the sick, and sometimes education to those who sought it. Monks had copied legal records, tended to orphans, and offered spiritual counsel to the desperate. When these places closed, no one replaced them. In some towns, the warming rooms turned cold. The hearths that had once simmered with broth now held only ashes. Old people who had once found rest inside the guest halls now wandered without shelter. And still, the silence was not total, because in a few corners of Europe, the monastic rhythm survived. In parts of France, Italy, and Spain, reformed orders like the Benedictines and Carthusians continued quietly. Their fires still glowed in early morning hours. Their chants still echoed off stone walls. Their rulebook still dictated when to sleep, pray, and eat. These communities, often stripped of wealth and influence, returned to simpler, more contemplative lives. Ironically, in losing their power, some monasteries rediscovered their purpose. And yet, a question lingered. Could silence govern? Could order survive in a world that now demanded speed, efficiency, and profit? In many ways, monasteries had governed not through laws or armies, but through discipline and example. The abbot ruled, yes, but his power came from consistency. Meals were eaten at the same time. Work was divided clearly. Confession was routine. The fire was always kept. These small rituals created predictability in a world where kings might change weekly and wars seemed to bloom overnight. Even centuries later, this principle still resonates. Hospitals, universities, and even bureaucracies borrowed heavily from monastic models, detailed schedules, shared resources, structured roles, and archives of knowledge. You might not see a monk in your local city hall, but the way records are kept, the belief in written continuity, owes much to the scribe sitting beside a smoky fire in a 12th century monastery. In the modern world, the monastic vision persists, even in unexpected ways. In Japan, Zen monasteries emphasize silence, order, and mindful labor. In parts of Europe, Trappist monks still live in secluded communities, brewing ale or baking bread to support their work. In certain rural areas, small Catholic monasteries still function as local centers of community, offering counseling, emergency food, or simply a place to sit in peace. And in our personal lives, traces of the monastery remain. The morning alarm, a modern bell, the daily schedule, even the urge to disconnect and find silence. Many who struggle with the chaos of modern life retreat into something remarkably monastic: a quiet cabin, a structured routine, a digital Sabbath. What's clear is that the monastery was never just a place. It was a rhythm, a fire kept, a bell rung on time. It taught that governance could be gentle, that order could be created not by shouting, but by showing, that sometimes the best form of leadership was consistency, hospitality, and a refusal to let the fire go out, no matter the storm outside. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, advised abbots to be both strong and compassionate, firm yet gentle. It warned against favoritism, excessive punishment, and pride. Let the abbot strive to be loved rather than feared, it read. And in those words, we see a vision of governance rarely practiced but deeply longed for, a rule that doesn't dominate, but guides. As we close this story, imagine again that quiet room at the heart of a monastery. The fire is small but steady. The stone walls hum with the echo of centuries of prayer. Outside, the world shifts. Kings fall, empires rise, revolutions stir. But inside, someone is turning pages. Someone is brewing tea. Someone is sweeping dust from the floor. And always, always, the fire is still warm. Because sometimes, the quietest command is the one that endures the longest. In the shadowy offices of Victorian London, where damp coal dust clung to coats and ink froze in winter, a quiet revolution was taking place. Not one of banners or marches, but of ledgers, tables, and numbers. It was the 1860s, and the British Empire was at its height. Steam-powered ships and factories, railroads crisscrossed continents, palaces sparkled in the heart of cities. But beneath the grandeur, deep in the slums of East London or the industrial hollows of Manchester, a different story unfolded, one of soot, stomach cramps, and silence. And so, a question began to haunt the halls of the Home Office and Parliament. Alike, what does poverty actually look like? And more importantly, can it be measured? The answer came not from a general or a lord, but from a series of tireless, often faceless men known as the poor law inspectors. They weren't particularly celebrated. Their uniforms weren't regal. Their tools were clipboards, quill pens, and charts. But their mission was enormous. to record, quantify, and ultimately control the experience of poverty in Victorian Britain. They weren't interested in moralizing, not yet. They were interested in data. One of the first challenges was defining. The very word destitute. Was a hungry child with one pair of shoes truly poor? What about a widow who lived alone but owned a teapot? Or a miner who could afford meat twice a week? To bring order to this sprawling uncertainty, bureaucrats began to count everything. They measured calories consumed per day by poor families in Bethnal Green. They recorded how many ounces of bread a mill worker's wage could buy. They weighed soup portions, counted coal shovels, logged how many shirts a child wore before the elbows gave out. Some even timed the intervals between coughs in overcrowded tenements to understand the spread of tuberculosis. Their records were stunningly granular. One inspector working in 1867 documented the exact composition of a meal eaten by a family of 6. 2 cups of flour gruel, 1 over 2 teaspoons of lard, 1 pinch of salt. Boiled in an iron pot for 14 minutes, he estimated it provided 378 calories, which, divided evenly, amounted to 63 calories per person. Not enough. Not nearly. Another bureaucrat described watching a mother feed her children watery cabbage soup, rationed in spoonfuls. She used 1 spoon to serve each child in turn. He counted the spoons, 7 per child, 35 in total. That was the day's meal. They weren't just measuring meals. They were measuring suffering, quietly, precisely, unemotionally. This detached tone was both their greatest strength and their deepest flaw. On one hand, it allowed the state to build policies grounded in information. These reports eventually influenced housing reform, food programs, and public sanitation. But on the other, it stripped away the human noise, the laughter, the tears, the dread, reducing lives to numbers in a report margin. Still, the inspectors pressed on because the alternative, guessing, had failed spectacularly. In earlier decades, poor relief was largely based on assumption and hearsay. Gentlemen guessed how much food a family needed. Charities guessed how many blankets were enough. And officials guessed which neighborhoods needed aid most urgently. But guesses often favored those who appeared respectable, while the truly desperate, unwashed, ill, foreign, were ignored. So, the bureaucrats turned instead to proof. They noted how long a widow's rent went unpaid before eviction. They calculated the average age of a labourer's death in Liverpool versus Leeds. They graphed the rise of workhouse admissions during winter months, cross-referenced with grain prices. They studied clothing too. One 1874 report described a man's coat as a single garment of burlap stitched from a grain sack. Another listed a child's shoes as wooden slats tied with leather string, unsuitable for wet ground. These were not insults. These were evidence, and the method was spreading. Universities began training social statisticians, a new class of thinkers who believed that truth lay in counting, and that even the bleakest realities could be mapped. Charitable groups followed suit. The Salvation Army, the Quakers, and urban missions began to keep precise records of how much aid was given and what results were seen. At first, the numbers seemed cold, but something strange happened. When Parliament read a report that described a neighbourhood where children under 5 had a 47% mortality rate, they could no longer look away. The facts had become more vivid than the rumours. The numbers, like dust, had settled everywhere. But even the most rigorous reports couldn't hide certain truths. For all their measurements, the bureaucrats never quite captured despair. They couldn't chart what it meant to feel hunger in your bones, or what it felt like to boil the same turnip twice, or to choose between coal and bread. These things couldn't be counted, yet the work continued, and as each dusty ledger page was filled, Victorian Britain slowly began to confront its reflection, not just in mirrors, but in spreadsheets. It had tried to measure the cost of poverty, and what it found was that even suffering had a decimal point. In the second half of the 19th century, the numbers began to grow teeth. The statistics collected by Victorian bureaucrats weren't just gathering dust on government shelves anymore. They were beginning to influence policies, budgets, and even public attitudes. The seemingly boring practice of counting bowls of porridge and measuring inches of blanket was evolving into something much more potent, a tool of political pressure. At the heart of this shift was a growing realization, uncomfortable, unsettling, and impossible to ignore, that poverty wasn't accidental, it was systemic, and if something could be measured, it could also be managed, restricted, or even ignored, depending on how the data was framed. The bureaucrats of the time didn't speak in passionate tones. They rarely wrote about injustice or compassion. Instead, they used words like deficiency, morbidity, deficit. But their tone didn't matter. Their numbers screamed. Take Charles Booth, for instance. A businessman turned social reformer. Booth didn't trust the wild claims flying around Parliament that a quarter of London lived in poverty. So, between 1886 and 1903, he set out to conduct one of the most ambitious social surveys ever attempted. Booth divided London into small districts, then colour-coded them based on poverty levels. Black meant chronic destitution. Yellow meant comfortable working class. Red was upper middle class. He walked the streets himself, interviewed constables, counted broken shoes, mapped every alley. When he was done, he'd proved something shocking. Not 25%, but over 30% of Londoners lived below the poverty line. This data shook the upper classes. Booth wasn't a radical. He wasn't a socialist. He was methodical, conservative, and calm. And yet his charts revealed that the empire's capital was rotting from the inside out. Inspired by Booth, other studies followed. The most famous came from Sebom Rowntree, who analysed poverty in York. He created a poverty line, a fixed number of calories and items a person needed to survive, and then calculated who was falling below it. His conclusion, 28% of York lived in poverty and many were employed. In other words, work did not guarantee survival. This was a dangerous idea. It suggested that the system was flawed not because of laziness or vice, but because of design. And yet, the government didn't rush to reform, because numbers, for all their clarity, could be weaponized in both directions. Some used the data to argue for housing improvements, school lunches, and public health programs. Others used it to enforce stricter poor laws, workhouse labor, and surveillance. If someone was eating 800 calories a day instead of 600, perhaps they didn't need help after all. One inspector in 1889 argued that because a man had eaten half, a loaf of bread and a few ounces of cheese in a day, he was clearly above the destitution threshold. Never mind that he'd slept in a freezing cellar and hadn't eaten meat in months. The numbers had become a kind of shield, both for change and for cruelty. This period also gave rise to the first attempts to standardize poverty. The government began drawing up poverty scales, detailed lists of what a person needed to live. These included 3 lbs of bread per day for adult Mentwu lbs, for women 1.5 lbs, for children 1 oz of fat daily, 1 pint of milk weekly, 2 changes of underclothing, 1 pair of boots per year, and, famously, no more than 14 spoonfuls of soup per person per day, where soup is a primary caloric source. These calculations weren't random. They were based on metabolic estimates, labor conditions, and cost of living. But in their precision, they also became cold instruments of judgment. If a mother gave her child more soup than the guidelines allowed, it was evidence that she was wasting resources. If a family had a third blanket, perhaps they were hoarding. This logic led to intense scrutiny of the poor. Inspectors began to write not just what people owned, but how often they smiled. One report noted that a woman laughed too freely for a widow of 2 years, implying moral decay. Another recorded a man who shaved thrice weekly despite limited soap, as though grooming were a luxury too far. It was poverty not just measured, but monitored, and always the numbers marched on. Coal usage, soap rations. Hours worked, miles walked, spoiled potatoes. It all went into ledgers, and in those ledgers, a new portrait of the Victorian poor began to emerge. Not lazy, but exhausted. Not wasteful, but strategic. People who stretched crumbs, recycled water, and patched clothes until the fabric gave up. By 1890, even some lawmakers had begun to acknowledge the uncomfortable reality. The poor weren't failing to thrive. They were surviving a system built without them in mind. But the deeper truth was even harder to face. Some parts of society needed poverty. The factories needed cheap labor. The coal mines needed desperate men. The textile mills needed nimble fingers. As long as someone was counting soup spoons, someone else was making profits. In this way, the Victorian bureaucracy became not just an observer of poverty, but part of its machinery. Still, something had changed. The act of measuring suffering had made it harder to ignore. The inspectors, without meaning to, had forced the nation to look, and then look again. They'd used their ledgers like mirrors, and the reflection wasn't noble. Yet even as they wrote their final numbers for the decade, they knew. There were things even spoonfuls of soup couldn't measure. As the 20th century loomed, the quiet scribbles of Victorian inspectors had done something strange and unintended. They had created a body of knowledge, a grim catalogue of need and deprivation that began to breathe on its own. It moved beyond dusty filing cabinets and leather-bound ledgers. It began to appear in speeches, editorials, and eventually laws. Data, once used to measure suffering, was now feeding change. In 1906, just 6 years after Queen Victoria's death, the British Parliament passed the Education, Provision of Meals Act. For the first time, children from impoverished families were legally entitled to a free meal at school. It wasn't compassion that drove the bill forward. It was numbers. The statistics were undeniable. Malnourished children could not learn. Inspectors had shown that some students arrived at school having eaten nothing for days. One memorable report described a boy with feet blue from cold, shirt threadbare, and no breakfast but cold cabbage water. He'd fallen asleep during lessons, not from laziness, but because his body was conserving energy just to stay alive. It was hard to argue with that. Even the most indifferent ministers began to nod. By 1908, old age pensions followed. Again, not because Victorian society had grown tender, but because it had grown practical. The cost of letting the elderly fall into destitution and workhouse care had grown too steep. It was cheaper, statistically speaking, to keep them fed. It was, in effect, reform by arithmetic. But the shadows of the earlier era lingered. Many of the inspectors who had once counted soup spoonfuls now found themselves asking deeper questions. What was poverty, really? Was it a lack of calories, a shortage of boots, or something harder to tally, like hopelessness? In their notes, a subtle shift began. The reports grew more reflective. Some inspectors began to question the scales themselves. One wrote, "We have weighed bread and fat, but cannot yet quantify dread." Another, after interviewing a mother who walked 11 miles to find coal, simply scribbled, "Her math is better than mine. 1 fire, 4 children, no margin for error." Even as policy evolved, many bureaucrats felt their work had reached a strange impasse. They had collected mountains of data, but the gap between rich and poor remained vast. And so the next generation of thinkers began to emerge, scholars and economists who took the raw data and tried to turn it into models, formulas, and theories. The idea was simple, but dangerous. If poverty could be understood systemically, then it could be fought systemically too. This was the foundation of what would eventually become modern welfare economics, built not from ivory towers, but from the hard, cold numbers recorded by nameless clerks in coal-dusted towns. But even now, with data expanding and policies shifting, the early mindset of Victorian bureaucracy remained. Every inch of help had to be measured. One widow applied for a bread allowance. Her file noted, has 3 spoons, should only require 2. Further verification pending. Another family was denied coal assistance because one member was seen consuming an orange during Lent. The implication? Excess. There was always a ledger, always an index card, always a suspicion that maybe, just maybe, someone was doing too well to be poor. And still, the inspectors walked. They walked into tenements where mold grew faster than children. They measured firewood by weight and recorded coughing fits by frequency. They noted how often a child blinked, how long a husband had been gone, whether the blankets were too thick for the season, and quietly, many grew weary. In one 1911 journal, an anonymous inspector confessed, "I have measured the dust. I have counted spoonfuls of soup, and still I do not know what makes a home break under winter's weight." It was one of the last entries before he retired. His replacement was younger, more energetic, armed with new forms and a shiny brass scale. But the system still stood. It would take world wars, revolutions in medicine, and the collapse of empires before poverty began to be seen as something more than a set of deficiencies. Before it was viewed not just as a failure of individuals, but as a failure of structure. Yet in a quiet way, the Victorian clerks had laid the groundwork. They had drawn lines between meals and school attendance, between coal and sickness, between missing teeth and shortened lifespans. Their records, dull and bureaucratic, had become the bones of social policy. The numbers they wrote now whisper from across history. We saw what they lived through. We wrote it down. We measured it so others could no longer pretend it didn't exist. Today, many of their methods seem crude, even cruel, but in their insistence on counting, they made poverty visible, and once something is visible, it can no longer be fully ignored. That's the strange legacy of Victorian bureaucracy, not just clipboards and cold figures, but a reluctant first step towards seeing the poor as part of the nation's story, not its background noise. They didn't end suffering, but they made it undeniable. And sometimes, that's where the real change begins. And that brings us to the end of tonight's quiet journey. If you're still awake, thank you for spending this time with me. Don't forget to let me know where you're tuning in from. And if this helped you relax, feel free to subscribe. Sleep well. Until next time.